Stephanie A. Malin, Ph.D., Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at CSU and Adjunct Professor with the Colorado School of Public Health, is an environmental sociologist specializing in natural resource sociology, governance, and rural development, focusing on community impacts of extraction and production of oil and gas. Dr. Malin will share her multi-year research on how fracking can impact daily life, mental health, and environmental justice in communities that have it. She will draw on research conducted in northern Colorado since 2014 and will tie to environmental sociology and current work regarding how to maximize environmental equity in these spaces, given how vital it is to people's well-being, feeling in control of their daily lives. Her first 3 years' data was funded by National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, a branch of the NIH. But she has continued the study given the need here in Colorado. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box, write her name and your question during her presentation. Award-winning author, teacher, outdoor woman, wife, and now new mother. I give you Dr. Stephanie Malin.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Malin. I am a professor of sociology at Colorado State University in the sociology department. And I'm going to be giving a talk today called Oil, Gas, and Environmental Justice in Colorado, Evidence of Diminished Quality of Life. I also wanted to mention, for those of you who work in public health, that I'm an affiliate with the Colorado School of Public Health. I also work with the Colorado Water Center and the School for Global Environmental Sustainability. So I am pretty involved on campus with these issues. And for those of you who are interested, we just started a center on campus called the Center for Environmental Justice. So please check out our website if you're interested in these environmental justice topics. So before I jump into a little bit on oil and gas development and its mental health and social impacts, I wanted to talk a little bit about environmental sociology because that's what I do and hardly anyone has ever heard of it. So I want to make this something that's really accessible so that you understand where I'm coming from, the kind of science that I do, and the kind of methods that are used in a study like the one that I'll talk about. So environmental sociologists like myself study kind of what it sounds like, right? How the social and the environmental interact with each other. And in particular, this is a subfield in sociology that started in the 1970s. And it really focused on the fact that even though we're all embedded in environments, we depend upon the environment for our daily lives, we often ignore it in sociology until this became a subfield. So our big questions are how the social, biophysical, and economic systems or other systems that we've created interact with each other, right? And how all these human created systems affect the natural world or the built environment in which we live. Some of our big questions as a subfield are how do societies and economies interact with the natural world? How are resources, even goods or bad? So things like bike paths, public transportation, beautiful views, right? How are those sorts of environmental goods distributed in a society versus how the environmental bads, things like hazards and toxins and risks in our environment, how are those things distributed within society? And that's especially what environmental justice scholars study. We also study who decides, right? So what's the process for zoning and for where we put these good things and these bad things within social systems, within communities, right, within counties? And what does this all mean for sustainability? And what is the institutional context? So a lot of people don't understand what sociologists study, right? We study social systems, we study institutions, and we study patterns within those. And we use different methods to do that. So today I'll be focusing in on some of the impacts of oil and gas production, specifically unconventional oil and gas production along the Front Range. And here we have a map that the Denver Post created that gives us a sense of just along the area in around Weld County and Larimer County, the northern part of the Front Range, what we're really seeing in terms of the scale and the pace and scale of development for unconventional oil and gas development, as well as other kinds of oil and gas development. So when we talk about unconventional, I'm just meaning hydraulic fracturing as part of what's utilized. It's unconventional because it's less conventional to combine the vertical drilling and the horizontal drilling that we see more and more when we use hydraulic fracturing to put high volumes of water, chemicals, and sand down that vertical and then the horizontal well bore. And from this map, we can see that there are thousands, tens of thousands, in fact, of wells that have been drilled along this part of the Front Range. You can barely even see the map, save for all of the permits that have been given for oil and gas drilling. And primarily we're extracting oil along the Front Range and along this part of Colorado. But of course, natural gas is present in oil. So I just want to give us a sense of the scale. And so when we talk about mental health impacts, we're talking about impacts that thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, in fact, are dealing with. And I focus particularly on people who live within about a mile of a well pad, but some of them live much, much closer where they can see a well pad from their deck or from their bedroom window, for example. But this gives us a sense of the scale. Now in Colorado, like in other states where there's a lot of oil and gas development, so states like Texas, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, there are certain social stressors that social scientists have found in a pattern in these different places. The main social stressors that I'm going to focus on today and that are important to understand for a background are division within communities and contested governance. And I'm going to unpack a little bit what those fancy sociological terms mean. Divided communities, pretty easy to understand, right? You have some communities that have a lot of division within them. Most communities, in fact, in terms of how people feel about unconventional oil and gas production, as well as what the impacts are and what the institutional contexts are. So the benefits and costs of this activity can be really unevenly distributed, where you've got land use conflicts within a community, right? Some people want this activity, some people do not. Some people, even if they agree with it, they might have well pads on their land. They're still dealing with some of the mental health impacts and the other impacts that we'll talk about later in this presentation. So we really see a lot of differences within communities about how people want land used, right? And the people who have the least power are often those who don't own property and those who don't own mineral rights. So those people that don't own the oil and gas reserves or the other minerals that we find in the subterranean environment, so underground. In Colorado, we have something called split estate. A lot of Western states and other states have this, where the surface, the ability to own the surface, is severed or split from the ability to own what's underneath the surface. So if you own a home in Colorado, for example, if you're lucky enough to own a home and you have that wealth, right, and that asset, you still don't own anything below 300 feet below the surface for most of us, right, for the vast majority of us. And this really leads to those benefits and costs being unevenly distributed and access being something that we can't really control, even if we have a home that we own on the surface. Now, contested governance just means we're fighting over who rules over or governs these processes, right? Who does the regulation, who does the zoning, and who decides what this looks like and what access to these different pieces of land actually looks like. And Colorado regulates in a way that the state itself regulates, right? So we're having some rulemaking going on currently. Many of you are aware, right? Senate Bill 181 is still in process, where we're trying to privilege public health and environmental well-being. But as it stands right now, Colorado, the state, still regulates oil and gas production here. There is one body, the COGCC, or the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, that regulates and permits almost all oil and gas activity in the state. It is the sole permitting body. And this will be really important for us later in the presentation, because they are a major institution in terms of people's well-being, how we decide who zones, who has a seat at the table, and these procedural equity issues that we'll look at. So that's really important for us to understand, as well as the fact that until Senate Bill 181 actually comes into law and we have rules to enforce related to it, right now the rule of the land, right, from the Colorado State Supreme Court is that people who have, and operators or companies that have mineral rights, they have the final say in whether or not development happens. It's not those local communities. It's not the people who live on or own or interact with the surface. It's the people and the corporate entities and government sometimes who own those mineral rights. And if you try to stop development and you don't own the rights, it's seen as a taking until we have something else in our state that replaces that. So those are some important background bits of information about the important institutions and the kinds of social stress that we're seeing. Just to give us a sense of the scale, right, of unconventional drilling, it's boomed across the United States since about 2008. This is driven a lot by unconventional kind of lending that's going on with the low interest rates from the Great Recession in 2008. And we're also seeing the impacts of the 2005 Energy Policy Act, where things like hydraulic fracturing and nuclear power production, those were really deregulated with that. And so every state kind of got to decide what they were doing. And the industry is exempt from 7 out of 15 federal environmental regulations. So they could really spring up everywhere, and every state had to kind of decide how they were going to regulate. What's happened because of this is we've seen a boom in production. It's made the US the #1 producer of hydrocarbons. Colorado has seen its oil extraction quadruple since about 2010. And since about 2010 as well, natural gas extraction has increased by about 51%. Now, importantly, the COVID-19 pandemic has really impacted the oil and gas industry, as many of you probably are aware. There was also a bust in 2015. This displays the boom and bust nature of the industry and the kind of extraction that's going on. But these numbers are also different now, and we don't really have statistics that have caught up. So we'll see how this pandemic has impacted these numbers. But initially and during the boom, we saw huge increases in Colorado's oil and gas activity. What I'll talk about a bit today is a project based in Colorado. It was funded by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, or NIEHS, and it is an arm of the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, Institute of Health. And they have several different branches. The National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, or NIEHS, that funded this study, they are looking specifically at environmental health. So what kinds of activities are going on in the environment that may impact public health. And what myself, Lisa McKenzie, John Adgate, and other members of this team that conducted this research have done is we've looked at, and we got a grant to study, the quality of life and stress impacts from living near unconventional oil and gas activity, specifically from living near wells when they're using hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as a lot of people call it. We asked this question and we got this funding because there's a growing body of evidence that there are negative public health outcomes related to this kind of activity and vulnerable populations, right? This has really been emerging in what we call the literature, right? So peer-reviewed data since about 2013, 2014. And as some of the folks who are presenting today will certainly highlight, there has been just an exponential increase in the studies that show these problems, right? Lisa McKenzie, John Agate are publishing in it. I'm publishing in it. There are many other folks that are doing studies that are showing that there are some negative public health outcomes. And what we were consistently seeing in our research before this was people, even if they agreed with this industry, right? Even if they agreed with the activity or they had well pads on their land, they were still feeling stress. They would report feeling stress, having impacts to their quality of life that were often negative, and other negative mental health impacts. So we picked up on that and we wanted to formally study it. And that's why we got this funding. And we looked primarily at folks who live in close proximity to unconventional oil and gas facilities, finding, as I'll get into, right, that there were increased levels of stress, increased levels of self-reported depression. So we're not talking about people being diagnosed formally or me being able to get into their medical records, right? But these are people's perceptions and reports of their own mental health experiences. What this related to, or what this culminated in, was a reduced overall quality of life. So to get a little nerdy for you, the project methods, for those of you who want to understand what does a social scientist actually do and how do we come up with these results. We are in these communities for over 3 years. I'm actually still conducting interviews and field work in these communities because there's been such interest in continuing to participate in the study. So I'm self-funding my research years after the NIH funding has run out in 2017. The data here, what we did was look at multiple communities, and we used mixed methods, which means we used qualitative and quantitative methods, as well as epidemiological and other biomarker kind of data. So this was one of the richest, most long-term studies that's been conducted on this question to date, particularly in Colorado. The 3 communities that we focused on were Greeley, Windsor, and Fort Collins. particularly for the survey instrument that we distributed back in 2014, 15, and 16. We sampled hundreds of households in each community. We used this thing called stratified random sampling, where we picked areas that were near certain well pads that would increase their activity while we were conducting the research to see what the impacts of activity were. So we specifically sampled from neighborhoods that had oil and gas activity very actively near homes. This also focused on in-depth interviews. That's the part that I'm still conducting. To date, I've conducted over 100 interviews along with some of my graduate research assistants. Many of you out there may have participated in our interviews to some extent. And we also use a method called participant observation, where we're actually in these communities, we're going to public meetings, we're spending time in people's homes, for example, if they'll invite us in, to see what it's like to live among oil and gas activity. So it's all about actually being on the ground, doing grounded ethnographic research. I've also used a method called photo voice with the help of some of our community partner organizations, where people will volunteer to take pictures on their cell phone or on provided cameras, and they'll send those to me or other members of our research team, along with a narrative of what they're showing us, right? So a lot of these pictures that you'll see here are taken by me as I do participant observation, or they're taken by some of our study participants who have taken pictures to show us the impacts of quality of life and to their stress levels of having industrial activity within neighborhoods, right? So even though, like I talked about before, right, zoning doesn't seem all that exciting, it's key to these issues because it's where we decide where we put certain things in communities, like residential activity, residential home, commercial, schools, all those activities versus industrial or agricultural activity. And importantly, right, I won't get into this today, but a big part of the study was also the epidemiological and exposure science part, where we would look at biomarkers of stress. We had field sites set up throughout northern Colorado where people who were vetted very carefully for other health problems or markers were accepted into our study, and they would give us different samples, things like hair samples, cheek swabs, blood samples, so that we could look for different biomarkers of stress to relate the data that we were getting from the social science component that I was leading to actual epidemiological and biological evidence through biomarkers of the presence of stress. So a really interesting kind of study design. Now, what I found as part of my social science research on this is that institutional context really matters when we're talking about the mental health impacts of oil and gas production and their sociological impacts as well, especially or specifically when we talk about environmental justice issues. So where do these activities end up, right? Distributive justice, and who decides? So procedural justice. And I'll get to those terms more officially in a moment. So in a nutshell, right, institutional context, specifically how we interact with and whether or not we trust state institutions like the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, like the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, right? These things really matter. And how well they listen to us, whether they listen to us, whether we have a seat at the table to help them make decisions about permitting, for example, these things all really matter in terms of the mental health and stress impacts of this activity. And what the study has found is that procedural inequities, so whether or not people can access information that is useful, that they understand, that's translated so that lay people who don't have degrees in toxicology, for example, can understand the information. The lack of that kind of useful information, especially at the beginning of the boom in activity, so between 2010 and 2015 or so, that really mattered in terms of a lack of communication about risks that people were facing, particularly public health risks and environmental risks. There's also, as I'll get to, a finding here that there's been a lack of opportunity for public participation in making decisions about where these activities end up, how close they are to people's homes, how close they are to schools, hospitals, places where we might go shopping, ride our bikes, spend time in the park, right? All of these things really mattered in terms of the process we use to decide where hydraulic fracturing and other aspects of oil and gas development end up, and whether or not they had an impact on people's mental health. Now, in terms of environmental justice, remember that's one thread of environmental sociology that I specialize in. There are different components of it. And in this presentation and for this study, we'll focus on two different threads. There are four major ones, but we'll just focus on two: distributive justice and procedural justice. Distributive justice is just what it sounds like, right? Where do we put or how do we distribute those toxics and hazards and those good things too, right, in the environment around us. Is it inequitable? Do we see that they end up in more communities that have people of color or who are poor, right? And there's a definite pattern of that in the United States where hundreds of studies have shown that we tend to put toxics, hazards, facilities that create them, the undesirable land uses, right? We put those primarily in communities that don't necessarily have the political will to fight back. They do, right? There's a whole movement around this, but they typically end up in communities of color and poor communities, and often there's both indicators present for a lot of these places. And this also asks who's exposed to these risks, right? So what I was just talking about in terms of what populations do we see exposed to them, those are all concerns of distributive justice. Procedural justice is all about the process, right? Procedural. How do we decide? Who decides? How do we zone? How we use land? And very importantly, who has a seat at the table? Whose voice is heard? And how authentically or meaningfully is it incorporated into decisions that we make, right? So not just kind of a check mark, like, did we give the public time to comment for 3 minutes apiece? Did we, kind of allow them to sit at the table? But were people of all different backgrounds actually able to have an impact that was meaningful and authentic on the process and on how we make decisions about this? And I want to point out too that when we talk about the environment, we often think about like wilderness areas or those sorts of places. That's part of the environment, right? But we in the United States at least spend about 90% of our time in the built environment. So in our homes, in buildings, at work, at school. During the pandemic, a lot at home, right? But the environment is anywhere where we live, work, play, or pray, right? That's kind of a tagline of the environmental justice movement. And it really points out that the environment includes these built spaces, especially when we're talking about environmental justice. So again, I'm going to take us back to this idea that institutional context matters, that in this study, we really found that procedural inequities are driven by an institutional context that might not allow for procedural justice, for example, that might not create a lot of meaningful participation and opportunities for that for members of the public that are still having oil pads or well pads in their backyard, right? So there has developed a real lack of trust in institutions like the COGCC among the public because of that lack of opportunity for participation and the lack of useful translated information that members of the public who didn't have specialized knowledge could access easily and understand and use to make decisions about their own levels of risk in terms of public health and environmental risks. So these procedural inequities, right, not having a seat at the table, not having access to clear information, this is what really related to uncertainty and powerlessness in terms of how people perceived their interactions with these institutions. So the major findings of this study are that the institutional and structural contexts around regulation of unconventional oil and gas production in Colorado contribute to negative mental health impacts. Well, all of that to say, when we have hydraulic fracturing or other pipelines, right, other aspects of oil and gas development near our homes, often we experience it as chronic environmental stressors, right? So these are industrial activities that are in the middle of areas that are zoned for residential purposes many times. So this leads to negative mental health impacts, diminished quality of life overall, and as I'll focus on in the next few slides, particularly increased or chronic stress and self-reported depression that's increased as well. And this was especially true in our findings in the surveys and in interviews for people living near development and living in host communities. So in other words, in the communities that host oil and gas production for the longest. So the longer you've lived there, the more these impacts seem to really get to you, right? And give you these negative mental health outcomes. Just so that you're aware, there's an article, I've written several articles on this that you can access online. There's one that just came out that's specifically about this in a journal called Energy Research and Social Science. And this is just a little snippet or a little screenshot of the cover page of that. So if you want to access that and read some of these findings, read some interview and excerpts and quotations, please feel free to look for that. Email me if you would like to, and I can send you a copy of the PDF if you can't access it. So another thing that sociologists do is we try to identify the mechanisms or the causes, the drivers, or any of those words work, behind why we see certain social outcomes, right? We're looking for relationships among different variables, right? to have really rigorous social science going on. So here I'm going to talk about two mechanisms that drive, this kind of negative mental health impact that we're seeing. The first mechanism is uncertainty, right? So the uncertainty that really permeated people's lives as they were trying to figure out, what are the economic impacts of oil and gas production, right? What are the health impacts? What are safety concerns? People were really uncertain about which institutions to trust. They were uncertain about how to access reliable scientific information, especially at the onset, right? Especially when we're looking at the years of 2010 to about 2015, 2016, right? There's a little more information now, but even that often requires getting those articles that are stuck behind a paywall, right? So you essentially have to pay $40 an article if you want to figure out what are the impacts. Or you go online to some of these state agencies and there are thousands of pages of information. Or you go to Frac Focus, right? And you try to look up, well, what's actually in the fracking fluid? And you need a degree in toxicology to understand the list of chemicals. There are over 500 chemicals, right, that go into fracking fluid. So we are looking at this and saying in this study, people are uncertain about all of these things. And many people I would interview, and this is highlighted in that article I just mentioned, they would talk about how essentially it's like you need a part-time job, right? The time equivalent of a part-time job to figure out what's going on. And so this uncertainty really permeated people's lives, and it continues to today, right? How do the people accurately assess risk in terms of public health, in terms of environmental risk? And these were things that people were left really uncertain about. And that's one of the really important underlying causes of the chronic stress, the increased self-reported depression, and just the overall negative mental health impacts that people experienced. The second mechanism is powerlessness, right? So even if people did have access to information that was translated, that they could use, that they understood, there was then a barrier between knowing those things and being able to do anything with that information. So members of the public and local communities did not have that typical kind of control that many communities, not all, but many communities in Colorado are home rule communities. This means that within municipal boundaries, communities get to decide, townships, right, get to decide what sorts of activities go on within their community. For example, we have legalized medical and recreational marijuana in the state, but not every township allows that within their borders, right? Not every township allows many other kinds of economic activity and other activities. That is the prerogative of home rule control. And oil and gas gets to be outside of those rules most of the time. People are unsure how to realize procedural equity. So those ideas of having a seat at the table, having space for authentic participation, they don't feel like they're able to truly participate in deciding, how do we zone where we put oil and gas production? How is it regulated? Right? There's a lot of people, even with Senate Bill 181 now, where public health and environment are privileged, that rightfully so are observing that the rulemaking period is taking a long time. And there have been thousands of well pads that have been permitted in the meantime. We also have about 55 to 60,000 operational wells in the state, right? And there's not a lot of sense from people that we've interviewed who participated in the study through the survey as well, that there's a lot of procedural equity in terms of making space for people to participate in public meetings and in other settings, right? And in terms of how we zone this activity. So there's little trust in multiple institutions, and Colorado State Supreme Court decisions, especially that decision I talked about earlier, where mineral rights holders were privileged in the finding of the state Supreme Court, right? That it was seen as a taking if local communities or anyone on the surface was to limit those mineral rights holders access to develop their oil and gas wealth or their assets below the surface. So those decisions, relationships with institutions, and not having what's perceived as a meaningful opportunity for participation have all resulted in the second mechanism of people feeling powerless. So we have uncertainty, we have powerlessness, and the outcome of all of this has been negative mental health impacts, that there's strong evidence that those occur, particularly chronic stress and self-reported depression, for people living near oil and gas facilities, especially those people who've lived in those communities the longest, like I mentioned before. Now, there are also other social problems that have emerged, including tensions within communities and those social stressors I mentioned before. So a lot of division and feelings of not having a lot of coherent feelings, or not having a lot of cohesion within communities, right? There are stark divides within communities and then between communities. So for example, if you look at one of our study communities, Fort Collins, it had a moratorium on oil and gas production voted on by its citizens in 2014 that was going on during part of the beginning of the study, versus a community like Greeley, just 30 miles down the road, right, which had a very different public acceptance of oil and gas production and has a lot of, or at the time had a sizable employment opportunity because of oil and gas production. Now, there's another article out there that I'll mention very quickly that talks about how this enhances industry meta power. So what that means is these experiences of powerlessness and uncertainty enhance the ability of the industry to set the rules of the game. And that's what meta power means. So having power over even how we make decisions, right? And how we structure institutions and those sorts of things in society that help us regulate, help us zone, help us decide where do we put these risks, where do we put the good things as well. And meta power refers to setting the rules of the game, right? And what we found a lot was that the industry was really able to do that, and that these negative mental health experiences enhance their ability to set those rules. So to kind of draw this to a close, the quality of life impacts that we're seeing from the oil and gas boom are really concentrated in terms of negative mental health impacts for people living near these sites. Specifically, there's diminished experiences for the public amid a loss of control over daily life or powerlessness, as I was talking about it, as well as that mechanism of uncertainty over where to access information, what the public health and environmental risks are. There are other areas where there's also uncertainty, which are not highlighted in this paper, but which I'm working on other papers about that have really been drawn from this study, including uncertainties about other aspects of health and public health and environmental health impacts, property values, right? So if we're seeing increased seismic activity in some places as we re-inject water underground, if it affects our property values to have well pads in our backyards, for example, these are all question marks that enhance uncertainty for people, as well as safety and impacts to family. We're also seeing a lack of trust in leaders and in industry. People aren't really certain who to trust. And even those views are part of why we're seeing those divisions in communities. And people are stressed that they don't have a seat at the table. I want to stress that even if people agree with this activity, right, even if they're making royalties from having well pads in their land or they own mineral rights, there's still a sense of stress and an experience of chronic stress from the uncertainty of these outcomes, including the economic outcomes, right? I mentioned before, this is a boom bust prone industry. So this is not a steady source of income, for example, or a steady source of employment. I'm going to share with you some photos here. This is one I took from a Lighthawk flight. Lighthawk is a nonprofit that will fly scientists over different areas where they're doing conservation or other research. This is a photo I snapped from the window taken of what goes on a well around a well pad. If you look in the top left-hand corner of this photo, you'll see a street there and a wall. Just across the street, there are farms, right? And there are farmhouses right there. So we have some open oil pits. We have a lot of other infrastructure, not just the well pad, that makes this a very heavy industrial activity, very close to the residential and agricultural activity going on in northern Colorado as well. This was part of the Photo Voice project, and this is a photo taken from the bedroom window, or actually the roof of one of our participants who had a large sound wall put up around the perimeter of her property as they put in a large array of well pads in what used to be open space behind her home. This sound wall was set up about 15 feet from her bedroom window and fundamentally changed the feel of her home, right, and her property so that semis could drive back and forth from that site. This is another photo taken during Photo Voice from a woman who lived in a neighborhood with well pads right behind her home. And the water that you see there is produced water. So what comes back up from hydraulic fracturing, it's often radioactive, it's often briny or really salty, and it has other contaminants in it. It's pretty dangerous. And this was just out in the street while her child was riding his bike around. And that's another shot from the same neighborhood. That dark colored water there is produced water that was spilled and not yet cleaned up. This is a photo I took from the 2013 floods, just kind of highlighting the vulnerability of some of this infrastructure to things like the sorts of floods that we saw in 2013. And now, unfortunately, with the wildfires we're experiencing, we may end up seeing that can lead to increased flood activity. So just to point out that people live near this infrastructure, right? Not just the well pads, but all kinds of infrastructure. And it can be vulnerable in times of natural disaster like flooding. So I want to thank you. I look forward to the Q&A session later today. And I want to thank you for your time and for attending this in what are certainly unconventional circumstances, but we really appreciate your attendance. Thank you.